So let me begin. I'm going to talk about the traditional Russian orthography. I will say what it is the difference between the modern orthography and the traditional one, why we need to use that traditional orthography today. I will explain what are the special challenges that we encounter when we try to do that, and how a project that I started about 15 years ago coped with that and enabled me to do some text processing in the old orthography. So what is called the old or traditional Russian orthography is in fact the orthography used by the classic Russian literature. So I listed some writers that you might have heard about, even if you're not a Russian speaker. By the way, may I ask who is a Russian speaker? All right. So I will show you something that would make sense even if you're not a Russian speaker. But basically, all these writers are the ones who studied the Russian in the old orthography at school and continued to write in the same way. In 1918, the orthography was reformed. 4 letters were eliminated from the alphabet and replaced by other letters. These letters were actually physically removed from printing presses in most cases, and in some cases, by mistake, another letter was also removed that was similar to the one, as you can see, that was not supposed to be eliminated. And people who saw Russian documents dating from the early 20s and early 30s often saw the lack of that letter being compensated by an apostrophe. The spelling of certain prefixes, suffixes, and certain word endings was also changed. I will talk about that in some more detail. The motivation for this reform was to help the poor school pupils who had so much trouble learning the spelling, and to simplify and bring the spelling closer to the pronunciation, which it did to some extent. However, outside Russia, the old orthography continued to be in use well into the 1940s. For instance, this is a first edition of Nabokov's short story Storm that was printed in Berlin in 1930. Nabokov started out as a writer for the Russian community in Berlin and Paris, and his works were printed in the traditional orthography. Now, for those of you who are Russian speakers, you see there are several changes that are obvious by looking at the text, such as the letters that were eliminated and other changes. Now, it is not unknown that language orthography changes. That's a natural process. Here's an excerpt from a 17th century English text, and if you look at it, you see small changes, such as a double L in natural, or the spelling of the words wisdom with an E at the end, or the word judge without an E at the end. These changes are relatively small. So suppose in some situation we would like to produce a text in this orthography, or we would like to have a critical edition of a classic text. So how would we prepare, let's say, a spell checker for this orthography? There are some very small changes. They're quite systematic. So basically a dictionary would suffice. You don't think so?
It wasn't standardized at that time. You could get the same word spelled 4 different ways.
Certainly. So you could try to, yes. So you could try to analyze that and find some kind of prevalent spelling that you could declare to be the spelling at that time in order to prepare a critical edition. It would definitely solve most of your problems. And this is because the changes in the orthography were gradual. They occurred naturally. Well, not so when the changes were mandated by a committee of experts. In order to give you a flavor of what kind of changes there were, I prepared here an imaginary proposal for reform of the English spelling that would be similar in detail to what happened to the Russian orthography. So let's first of all omit the silent E in word endings. And then we'll replace other vowels so that spelling is simplified. So for instance, instead of made, we just spell M-A-I-D. And instead of some, S-O-M-E, we spell S-U-M. That's just simpler. And we eliminate the E whenever it's not pronounced. Then we replace the letters C, X, and Y by K, S, and I, according to pronunciation. So let's just replace all that. So instead of hence, you would write hence with an S. And instead of played, you would write P-L-A-I-D. So let's make this change in order to simplify the spelling. And of course, we physically remove the letters C, X, and Y from computer keyboards. These letters are undesirable, and we attach political significance to their removal so that nobody can object. So now you see what kind of problems will be created right away by this kind of reform. The words that previously differed in spelling now don't. And you have to know how to pronounce them out of context, such as played or hence, made, and so on. So now you see what would happen if you wanted to prepare a text in the old orthography given the new one. You have a lot of disambiguation to do. So, however, this was what happened, and the result of it was that people got used to the new orthography. Old books became unpopular. It's a lot of work to change that in old books, because you mandated that no books can be printed in the old orthography anymore. So only a select set of books are printed at all from the old ones. So you effectively lose access, lose touch with your culture, with the accumulated experience of your country. And that's what happens in Russia today. The texts presented in this orthography are felt to be irrevocably obsolete, completely out of touch with anything that can be relevant today. And of course, no computers today support text processing in this orthography. This problem would be solved if we had computer support and a converter between old and new orthography. Of course, back then they didn't have computers. Everything had to be done by hand. Today, we would have if we had a converter, there's no problem. You don't like reading these old letters, just convert. Or if you want to print a critical edition of some old words, just convert. So what would be the challenges in conversion? So when I started this project about 15 years ago, Unicode was not a widespread technology. People mostly used 8-bit encodings. At that time, no 8-bit encodings for Cyrillics contained the 4 letters that were eliminated in 1918. There was no keyboard layout, certainly, containing that, because you couldn't have an encoding. Screen fonts did not include these characters. There were very few vector fonts that did. But at that time, vector fonts were not used for screen displays. They were too slow. So people used bitmapped fonts. LaTeX, curiously, had support for this, using a non-standard encoding prepared by the American Mathematical Society. But there was no support for spelling checker or hyphenation or optical character recognition. What is the situation today? Much better. These letters are present in most fonts. Everything is Unicode. You can print. You can type these letters if you go to Wikipedia and cut and paste, because Wikipedia has examples of these texts. LaTeX still has the font support, which is marginal but existing. There is now spelling checker support coming from my project and perhaps coming from other people. iSpell, I'm not sure if everybody knows what that is an old Unix text mode program for spelling check. OpenOffice has support for that, I believe, but it's not a standard part of the package. There is some commercial programs that can do optical character recognition in this orthography. Fine reader. But there is still no support for hyphenation as far as I know, and there are no standard keyboard layouts that you can install today if you wanted to prepare text. So what did I have to do back then? I prepared, first of all, an 8-bit encoding. There was no practical way of doing anything without an 8-bit encoding. So I changed a few characters in KOI8, and I made an encoding. I made a localization for a text mode browser called Lynx. I prepared keyboard layouts for the X Windows system and for Microsoft Windows so that I could type in this encoding. I prepared the on-screen fonts that were based on a previously existing Cyrillic on-screen fonts for X Window. These fonts now became part of standard packages that are still installable in Linux, the Cyrillic fonts package. I prepared a dictionary for the iSpell program, which is an affix-based dictionary. That is, you have word stems and a list of affix combinations that can be applied to certain word stems. Finally, I made a Postscript Typesetter. That is a program that could emit Postscript files that you could print with on-screen fonts used instead of vector fonts, because there weren't usable vector fonts. And I prepared also a dictionary-based converter between new and old orthography. So all that was done in Perl, which was the Python of that time, so to speak. Here is what it looked like. This is a screenshot from that time in Netscape, superimposed with the upper part of the ASCII table in the encoding that I created, with some letters put in certain places. So I was able to process text. For instance, here, I was actually editing this text. This is text printed in 1924 in Berlin. The spelling check looked like this. You opened a different terminal window, and there you had an interactive suggestion for the word that was misspelled. So spelling check was not something that you did automatically in the background as it is done today, but it was a separate operation. And so here you see a word that is spelled in the new orthography, and that is incorrect. And this is a possible replacement that you had to do by hand. So in this way, I was able to edit texts, print them, put them on the web, and well, for the few people who had interest for this, that was quite sufficient. Spell checking was fine. Optical character recognition did not quite work so well because you had to first teach the recognizer that there are some new characters and there's no dictionary, and so there was a lot of spell checking and proofreading to be done, but at least it could be done. So let me talk about the linguistic challenges. The basic problem with the transition between the traditional orthography and the modern one is that there are many changes that created ambiguities. These changes, for example, made certain words homographs, that is, words that are written in the same way but pronounced differently. Just like the example I gave you on the other slide, when you write made with M-A-I-D, that creates an ambiguity that didn't exist before in the language. And so a lot of these examples now had to be disambiguated in some way. There are some words that became actually homonyms, that is, words spelled in the same way and pronounced in the same way, but meaning different things. and there used to be not spelled in the same way. So these are some examples where you have to introduce the letter that was eliminated in some cases, but not in all cases. So you have to know when this needs to be done. And these words are not necessarily different parts of speech. They're sometimes different parts of speech, but not always. So restoring old letters in other places is less problematic. It can be done by dictionary. For instance, the letter theta corresponds to the places where the word of Greek origin would have a theta in it. This is quite typical. Like the word orthography itself must use the letter that was eliminated. And there are some examples like this where you replace the suffix, you replace the root of the word, and you just use a dictionary. So what I was able to do is mostly this kind of replacement that is dictionary-based. Because at that time, there was not a very easy way of getting a part of speech tagger or disambiguation based on semantics. However, it is not always sufficient to identify parts of speech. In some cases it is. In other cases, you have to identify the grammatical forms because you insert this eliminated letter only in certain grammatical cases, but not in other grammatical cases. In other cases, it's even more difficult because you have to understand the meaning of the word. For example, the word for peace and for the world has become a homonym. This is the same part of speech, and it's not possible to disambiguate unless you know what the sentence is about. Similarly, the word for flying and for healing became a word that's spelled the same and pronounced the same. And so in order to disambiguate that, to convert to the old orthography, you have to guess the semantics of the word in a sentence. That was definitely beyond anything I could do. So I left that for the manual check, for the manual proofreading, giving examples. Sometimes you can get disambiguation based on pronunciation. So I'm pretty sure that today I could have done a much better job. My converter worked in some simple ways. It had no real disambiguation. It had a dictionary-based lookup with some heuristics. So here's an example of converting a poem that most Russian speakers would recognize to the new orthography. You see that you would have to insert a few things in select locations, and that is how I would expect this to work. Today, I'm hopeful that we'll have better support for custom keyboards in different operating systems. Used to be much easier. Now there's a trend of not allowing the users the freedom to install different keyboard layouts. Hyphenation dictionaries for LaTeX, for example, or for other typesetting systems is an outstanding problem that I was not able to solve by just hobbyist effort. Spelling dictionaries are available, but grammar checking is another thing that is not quite available today for many languages. That could be another project. And finally, an ambitious project would be a fully disambiguating converter that would use all our technologies today in natural language processing, the part of speech tagging, semantic guessing could be quite useful here. I'm pretty sure that results would be a lot better if I could use these technologies. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Have you thought of implementing some of that, or maybe some of that is already platform compatible as far as model platforms such as Android, iOS?
So to implement a custom keyboard, for example, would be the first step. Most mobile platforms already implement full Unicode. I'm not sure that they do a lot of spell checking. Maybe they do. So what precisely would you like to see on your Android device? Because you can already see web pages and texts, right? So
let's discuss that after.
Okay, sure, we can discuss that. I mean, this is definitely a project that can be undertaken. Yes.
Just taking an example of the task, one of the tasks I had for was lemmatization. So you need to lemmatize documents into a Google dictionary.
So when you lemmatize, you get sometimes ambiguous words. So you have words that are spelled exactly the same in the modern orthography, but should be spelled differently depending on their meaning or depending on the grammatical case and so on in the old orthography. So some of the lemmatization will help. Lemmatization will be necessary and will help in some cases.
Depending on the dictionary, having the forms of every word.
Yes. But
the usage in the dictionary is incomplete.
Well, so you have a word that means different things.
As a dictionary helps you to understand.
And so when you lemmatize, do you get the one meaning that is actually used in the text? Or you just get one word stem that tells you what possible meanings it might have? So for example, if the words peace and world were the same word, would lemmatization help you distinguish them?
In traditional lexicography, lemma would mean dictionary entry. So win and line would be different entries even though they're spelled the same. And bank would be different entries even though they're spelled the same and pronounced the same. So in that sense of lemmatization, then it would give you what you want. But of course, some people use it just to mean separating into stem and affixes, in which case it wouldn't give you what you want.
So, okay, and so is that already available? So can you already lemmatize in the sense that you just described?
For some, I don't know about Russian. For some languages.
Russian, but this I can place it in NLP.
Right. Well, so if you could, yes. So if you could lemmatize so fine-grainedly as to distinguish words that are spelled the same and pronounced the same but mean different things somehow, then certainly it would, I would say, it would solve the problem. It would have to.
Again, from a purely terminological point of view, there's a morph analyzer would give you all the alternatives, but you would need a tagger to decide which of them is right in a particular context.
Right, we are out of time. Thank you for the questions.